everyone. So a few weeks ago, I had the amazing honor to be invited to England to work alongside one of the classiest group of funeral professionals I have ever met. And it is the staff at Uden and Sons Funeral Home just outside of London. They have multiple locations. And this group of individuals just blew me away. They're just some of the kindest, most professional, amazing people I have encountered in the business ever. Maybe it's the top hats. Maybe the top hat adds a level of class all on its own, but it was such a profound experience for me. I miss it. I miss being part of what they have going on there. So a lot of you have asked, what were the differences between England and America and the way that we do things? I've narrowed it down to 7 primary categories of differences that I saw between how things are done in England and how things are done in America. Some of them are by law, and some of them were just out of tradition and culture. Now, obviously, there's going to always be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be funeral homes who do not do things the way that I saw, and I only worked alongside one funeral home in a large country. So I'm sure there's multiple different ways that funeral homes in England do funerals and conduct themselves. However, I picked out some main items that I have, through study and through inquest, found traditionally across the country are primarily used, and those differences countering on what we do in America. So here we go. So number 1 is the licensure. Here in America, each state is a little different. So you can get a license in some states in funeral directing and a separate license in embalming. And some states are called a dual license, where it's a license that covers both areas. You cannot just get one or the other. Michigan, where I live, is a dual license. So I'm going to either be licensed as an embalmer and funeral director or nothing. Over in England, funeral directing is not something that you go to school to do. It's not something that you primarily get a license to do. It is a trade that you learn a lot of times through family passed down tradition, kind of like it used to be primarily in America, that it was a family business. Over there, same thing. So you learn by trade and you eventually are taking over doing all of these actions, meeting with the families, leading the funeral. So like the person that leads the funeral with that top hat, the conductor, that is the funeral director. That's not something you have to go to school for 3 years to do. It's not something you have to study certain things to do. By trade, you become a funeral director. On the flip side, embalming. That is something you do go to school in England for. You go, you study, and then you also work alongside typically another embalmer, kind of like an apprenticeship that you would be learning on site with someone else through the training. That is very similar to America, where we do the apprenticeship. We have to conduct so many embalmings under the tutelage or supervision of a supervisor. And so that there is pretty similar to what we do here in America. So along with the licensing of the embalmer, I did get to embalm alongside someone while there for a little while and did see some differences. You know, the funeral directors didn't know a lot about what the embalmers were doing. It was a very separated trade within that funeral business. And by choice, that's their category. This is our category. We don't need to know everything they're doing as long as they're doing their job. You know, if I invited a plumber into my house, I don't need to know everything the plumber's doing as long as they're doing their job and fixing what they need to fix and do their job thoroughly. That to me is what is important. And that was kind of the thought process over there as well. I'm hiring somebody to come do something, and as long as they're doing it well, I don't need to worry about all of the steps up to it. So there is trade embalming there, and there is in-house embalming. The trade embalmers, I was told, typically bring everything they need with them. Chemicals, machines, pumps, everything that they use. A handheld embalming pump, kind of like you would use if you were spraying weeds outside, where you create the pressure through a pump up and down, is often used to push in the fluid and then also to suck out the blood. So that was very common, which was new to me. I have never used that type of a device, even though it can be used, especially if we lose power here in America. You could use that kind of a device to do the embalming. So number 2, this was a huge difference that I encountered, and that is time delay. So here in America, 5 days is a pretty average from death till burial or cremation, a pretty average time. Person dies, the funeral home will go pretty immediately to the place of death, whether it's the hospital, the nursing home, the hospice care center, or a home, to bring the person into the care of the funeral home. We then meet with the family the next day, facilitate and schedule out the burial or cremation, and it's usually within a week everything is said and done. However, in England, there is a huge time delay, which was pretty surprising to me. I think I had heard about it through some of your comments on some of my videos and through discussion with some other funeral directors, but to hear how much of a delay was pretty surprising. So, an individual dies at a facility, often a nursing home or hospital. They're held there for a very long duration of time until a death certificate is actually filed and a paper is filed with the clerk. So what happens is the doctor has to sign the papers to release the body or to sign the death certificate. Then the family at that point has to then go and file that with the registrar's office, or what we would maybe call a clerk's office here in America. The family has to have a scheduled appointed time to meet with them to get that filed. Once that's filed, they will then get a paper that they bring to the funeral home. The funeral director can then go bring the person into the care of the funeral home. Typically by that time, the funeral director's met with the family. Things are maybe already talked through in the plan, there's just no scheduled day and time yet. So when they go to receive the person from the place of death, they may bring their coffin with them and place the person right into the coffin because that's already been picked out and purchased. That to me was huge. This process can take 2 weeks to a month before they can actually get the person from the place of death. Some of the things that do make it a longer process are if the person is going to have an autopsy, or if they're going to maybe be sent to another country, like repatriation, where they're sent back to, let's say, somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Asia or back to America even. That happens a lot at some of the locations at Uden and Sons funeral homes. So those were pretty shocking timelines to me, that they were working with such a huge weight. But families there are very understanding of it because that's how it's always been. They also have to sometimes schedule with the cemetery or with a crematory, and that can also take a number of days. So why does it take so many days? Let's just run a scenario. And this was one that the gentleman at Uden's and Son ran by me. So let's say a person dies. You then have to get, let's say they die on a Sunday. You have to then wait for the doctor's office to be open Monday. You call the doctor's office and they say the doctor is on vacation that week or is out of the office for several days. So then maybe they're back in the office Thursday. They don't get to sign in the paperwork till Friday. Then it gets sent back to you the following Monday, or back to where then the family can get it. So then the family has it. They call over to the registrar's office that following Monday. So now it's been over a week already. They call the registrar's office, and the registrar's office says, well, 8 days from now we have an open appointment, or 4 days from now, or 3 days even from now. So then the family can then go on that appointed date and time to file the paperwork, get the permit, and take that permit to the funeral home. So it could have been maybe 12 to 14 days by that point that they even get the permit to take to the funeral home. So then the body or person deceased is brought into the care of the funeral home. At that point, once they actually have the person in their care, they then call the cemetery to schedule. Well, we're scheduled out, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days as well at the cemetery. So then you have to schedule out another week sometimes for burial, or even for cremation, it may be scheduled out a week. So by that point, it's even 3 weeks or so from when the person died. And this is a very common, typical timeline in England.
Well, again, where I'm dealing with a lot of repatriations, I deal with a lot of families from different countries, and they always ask me this question: what is the delay? What's the hold up? One of the places we go to the most is Ireland. So obviously one of our closest neighbours, they will have a funeral within a couple of days.
Correct.
The biggest start is the bureaucracy of it. So someone passes away, whether they're at home or in a hospital, a doctor has to sign off the medical paperwork to allow the family to register.
Yeah.
A lot of the local hospitals will not release a deceased into a funeral director's care until they've got the document from the registry office.
Gotcha.
So it's a delay upon a delay. So say someone passes away in a hospital, the doctor that saw to that deceased last has to sign the medical certificate.
Right.
That doctor may have a couple of days off, or they're then on the late shift, getting the information to them to say you need to issue us with the medical certificate can take a couple of days.
Okay.
Once you've then got the medical certificate, you'll have to book an appointment with the local registry office. Okay. The registry office might not have an appointment for you for a couple of days.
Wow.
The family are then issued with the death certificate and the paperwork that would allow us to collect someone from a hospital. They'll come to see us. We'd then plan to go to collect, and then that could take a few working days, not from our side of things, but the whole process from the date of death to the day of seeing us to give us the paperwork to then collect. That can be a few working days. If they pass away at a home address or a nursing home,
okay,
we would then as soon as if the doctor's been to see the deceased to say they have passed away and they're certified to do so,
right,
we can then go and collect them. They'll be brought into our care. So in those kind of situations, we are collecting someone a lot quicker, but it doesn't help with the burial or the cremation side of things. It's still, the delay is still there because you still need to have the death registered, have the correct paperwork, because the paperwork that the hospital need for us to collect someone is the same paperwork that we need to send to the local crematorium or cemetery to allow the funeral to actually take place. There's a lot of paperwork that's needed.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so that's why there's a delay compared to a lot of other places.
Number 3 were the differences at the cemetery that I found. We visited 2 different cemeteries while I was there. And what I found was that kind of the setup of the cemetery and some of the things that happen within the cemetery were very different than America. So over there, funeral homes don't really have visitation rooms. You don't do a big public viewing like you do here in America, where everybody comes to the funeral home and spends a few hours and does things. They just have little viewing rooms where the family, we're talking like 4 or 5 people, come and see the deceased over the course of the time that the deceased is in the care of the funeral home. They would call the funeral home, say, I'm coming over. Then they would visit the person and then go about their day. Your big gathering place is at the cemetery or the crematory on site at a cemetery, possibly, wherever those 2 are, the crematory and the cemetery. They have the large chapels. That's where you gather to have your service prior to cremation or prior to burial. So everybody would gather there at the cemetery or at the crematory to have the service and then go over to the gravesite for burial. That was a very big difference. Some cemeteries here in America, yes, they have chapels and that's where services are sometimes held, but it's not the norm. Gathering there only to have the cemetery service is not usually the norm unless you're at the graveside. So that was one big difference. Then at the cemetery also, rather than purchasing the grave space, leasing is the common thing. So rather than having a perpetual ownership of a ground grave space, over there you would lease. So you would choose a time period, so 25, 50, 75 years. You would lease that space. That allowed you to place a headstone on the grave, and it's common to have double depth grave. So your loved one would be placed on the bottom, and there would still be a spot on top for another loved one. Well, after 25 years, if your family chooses not to release that grave space, they then remove the headstone, then can release that top grave space to somebody else. So you may be buried below somebody you don't even know, never met, and their headstone could sit on the grave that you're actually in below. Why do they do this? Ground space is hot commodity there. It is an island. It is a small island compared to America. And so they're running out of grave space. Mausoleums are not common, so going up is not common there. It's whatever ground space they have under, that's what they have to use. So they lease. And cemeteries are pretty costly, especially if you get into like London, right into the city, or in some of the more populated areas, because they are running out of ground space. So you have to get approval to be buried there and pay a really high top prime dollar in order to be buried there, or pound, not dollar, to be buried there. Also, at the cemetery, one major thing that was different was the use of vaults. Here in America, most cemeteries require that you use a vault for your burial. Their vaults are not commonly used. You would be buried directly into the ground, lowered rather than with a lowering device that we see here. You would strap lower the casket down into the ground, and that's where they would be, right into the grave. It did pose some problems. I did see a lot of sinking in spaces or headstones, because foundations were not as common there as well under the headstones, where the headstones were sinking and falling in. So I talked to the one cemetery, I talked to the groundskeepers, and they said, yes, the cemetery or the individuals who were leasing the space would, if they wanted that fixed, they would then have to hire somebody to come in and fix that headstone positioning, whenever they wanted it fixed. So it was more how we see some old school cemeteries here in America before they use vaults and before they use foundations, where things are kind of caving in and not, all flat. They're more topsy-turvy, crooked to the side, because there's not that vault holding up the ground, and there's not the base under the headstone. And headstones there also were a very big difference from here. A lot of them were full grave space covered, where they expanded along the full span of the grave space, and they were very decorative and kind of ornate. But here we would find, something that was smaller, that was easier for the grounds crews to maintain, trimming and such around, where there they were all sorts of variant sizes and shapes and colors, and took up a lot more ground space. So as I was saying, that viewing time is our next biggest difference. Rather than gathering at the funeral home, people in England gather at the disposition place. So if it's at the crematory, there may be a huge chapel, and after the service, behind the curtain would open, and the individual in their coffin would be taken out to the crematory space that was maybe right behind the curtain. And everybody that was out in the chapel would have left. Same with at the cemetery. They would go into this large chapel, have their service, and then go over for burial. That's very different than here, where we gather at the churches, or we gather at the funeral home for those large service times. Some cemeteries here, like I said, do have those gathering spaces, but it's more for a graveside short type committal service, usually. So that to me was a big difference. The viewing also, you would call and say, hey, I want to come over and visit mom for a little bit. They would bring mom out of the cold storage. if she hadn't been embalmed, because embalming's not as common there. And so they'd bring mom up for you to view her, and then when you were done, they'd put her back into cold storage because the preservation wasn't there if they hadn't done embalming. And so they want to keep her in the cold area as long as they can. And they're going to be stored for a lot longer when they have that bigger waiting time like we talked about as well. So coffins and caskets. Another difference. In England, coffins are the norm. That is the 6-sided burial container with one-piece lid that comes off and on, and typically there's like 6 screws around that attach the lid to the base. You can do viewing right in that coffin, or you can have them on a table for viewing if it's just like placing them back in the cold storage and bringing them out type situation, depending on what the funeral home does. They do have caskets there. Some people do prefer caskets, but coffins typically are the norm. They come in all different woods, all different shiny or matte or different stains, but they were very simple but elegant. No matter what the color or the style was, they were all so simple but so pretty at the same time. I really loved the coffin style for burial. It was really different, so different than what we use here in America, where we use caskets, either half couch or full couch. And so I loved seeing the difference. I loved the look and the old school feel of using the coffin over there. We do have coffins here in America. We can get coffins here in America. It's just not the norm. Costs. This was another area that kind of surprised me. So here in America, we have the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, that oversees funeral homes and making sure that costs are across the board regulated. As funeral homes here in America, we have to have a general price list that spells out a list of certain items and their costs on a general price list. That has to be able to be handed and provided to anyone at any time with those set amount prices on them. So that is very regulated, and that started so that funeral home A couldn't just make up a price for a funeral home to try to trump funeral home B's pricing, or to underhand another funeral home, or to just overcharge one family and undercharge another. So it was set for very specific, very good reasons. Over in England, they do not have those regulations. So different, you can quote different pricing, and if a family calls and needs help for maybe lowering a price because they don't have funds or something, you can kind of modulate or change your pricing based on each family. Not that that's bad, not that anything is illegal that they're doing, because they're obviously following their laws, but it was very different coming from some place that it is very regulated for us. I could see in the future, just as the reasons came up in America that we started those laws, that might eventually take place over in England as well, and start being more regulated to have one baseline that everybody has to run their business from. So the last, number 7, that changes or differences that I saw was in flowers. So we do use a lot of flowers here in America, but in England, flowers are a huge, huge part of the funeral process. The hearse is decked out in flowers on top and alongside, and the flowers that spell out a person's name or their position within a family. So Nan or Mom or Auntie or sister or brother, or the person's name, it'd say Kari on the side of my hearse, which would be kind of cool. Those are really, really prominent there. So that when this funeral procession is going by with the hearse and these limos, all of them are decked out in these flowers outside of the vehicles or right inside the glass, that everybody that you're going past can see. So it's kind of a status symbol almost, the amount of flowers and the type of flowers and the presentation of the flowers that you have. And when you don't have that viewing time, you don't have that visitation time where flowers are set up all around the casket and they're all, you know, around where everybody comes to gather, that really then is your time that you are presenting, is when you're going in procession and when you have kind of that setup going on. So that is kind of the balance to what our visitation viewing time is when it comes to the flower presentation. So at the cemeteries then, or at the crematory, what happens is you have all these flowers and they will set a little marker somewhere outside in the flower type area that'll have the person's name on. So after the funeral's done, if the person's going to the crematory or going out for burial, those flowers, every flower that's there, unless family's taking any home, those flowers will all be laid out near the marker with that person's name. They are then given a certain time period. So each cemetery can set their own time period. Like, these flowers will remain here for 3 days and then we'll dispose of all of them. So that way anybody that comes can go look and see, oh, look at all the flowers for Nan. And they can go see all of them. These also may be laid out in the cemetery near the person's grave if that's what their process typically is. But a lot of them have designated areas for floral tributes to be displayed. So this is a huge, huge part of the culture in England and of the funeral process. And I didn't realize how much a part it played until actually seeing it, and how these flowers are displayed so prominently. You know, if they're sent to the family's home, they're laid outside maybe the front, so everybody that comes to visit, everybody that drives by can see somebody has died at this house, flowers are being sent, they were loved, they were a huge part of this family, and they can see kind of the social reflection of that person through these flower displays, essentially. In America, we do have the flower displays. They're typically up by the casket during visitation or for the service, and then 1 or 2 might be able to be left out at the cemetery, but you don't leave a lot out at the cemetery per regulation typically, if any. So there's a big difference there. In America here, the family will take a lot home right off the bat, or they're donated to nursing homes or hospice facilities to be shared and used, and for others to, you know, get to share in the joy of flowers. But in both countries, you can see what a huge part of the economic revenue flower shops would play and florists would play. So that is a very big deal in both countries, that flowers bolster, I guess, your revenue and your income for your small businesses within communities. I learned such a vast amount of information in my 2 days working at Uden & Sons Funeral Home. They allowed me to get exposure to so many areas of what we do as funeral professionals, getting to work alongside an embalmer, walking through a whole funeral process, going to a crematory, 2 cemeteries, you know, just all these different things that I got to have experience and be upfront learning from. And I also got the amazing family that we spent the day with for the funeral just allowed me to be in the midst of all of it. And I got to photograph and see their tradition and their process and their tribute to their mother. So we'll be sharing that in another video as well, kind of my day of a funeral in England. I'll also be giving you a glimpse of Uden & Sons Funeral Home, and what really sets them apart is being such a classy group of funeral professionals. So look for those 2 videos coming soon as well. Thank you guys so much. Love to hear your feedback on this and other differences between America and England that you see when it comes to funerals. Thanks, guys.